All right. Crypto as a revolutionary center of power. One sec. So men adapt machinery to needs almost unconsciously and before they can formulate a reason for it. This is a passage I came across doing some of the research on this talk. It's inspired by Bob inviting me here and asking me to close out our wonderful Proof of Work Summit with a vision of the future. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball, and it's very hard to understand what the future of crypto might be. Moreover, men or women, we unconsciously work towards whatever we're working on, and we formulate the reasons after it. Show of hands who's actually seen Eric Voorhees' talk, Why Are We Here? Yeah, and permissionless, yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. If you haven't, I highly recommend doing it. Eric had the perfect embodiment of the spirit of crypto, of its rebellious nature, of the reasons why it exists, of the virtuosity and humanitarian efforts that it embodies, but also this rebellious nature, rebelling against the system and its unworthy authority, rebelling against coercion and servitude, against the economically ignorant, the imperious, and the ethically impotent. What Eric is doing is embodying a political formula for crypto. It is the basis of our legitimacy. Any of the projects that have any kind of salt within our space tend to either espouse these values or these properties of this political formula, and those that don't are often seen as illegitimate in some way. But as Eric speaks of rebellion, of saying no, he also recognizes that it's evident today that crypto is no longer on the fringes of society. It is no longer being ignored, and that our detractors, while they're still laughing at us, they're now actively fighting against us. With the advent of central bank digital currencies, online safety bills, Operation Choke Points, as has been mentioned multiple times throughout this sessions, as well as the global integration of a financial system and policing. He goes on to say that our salvation is our own responsibility. But he does this in the context of the utopian dream and the realization of an open, decentralized financial system. This vision has been able to spawn our entire industry and has attracted capital at worth $3 trillion at one point in its peak, and today still commands around $1 trillion worth of assets. Clearly, we're doing something that is finding favor with the people. And later on, we'll see why this might be true. To that end, our political project of creating a decentralized financial system with transparent and strongly enforced rules is well underway. But I believe that this vision is limited, and that the political and economic theory that has taken us this far is now starting to prevent us from appreciating what we're actually working towards, from seeing who we really are, and what prevents us from effectively organizing our movement now that our enemies are no longer ignoring us. But there's one point in Eric's talk that was really hit the nail on the head. He goes on to say that code is law is a misnomer, that code is better than law, that law is based on men and law is based on, there's law based on men and there's a law based on math. He asks, which is the most scientifically sound? Which is the better demonstration of order? And it is this word, order, that I think is really what is at the crux of what we're doing. We are creating a new social order, a new political system. And this harkens back to some of the other cypherpunk ideals and unrealized dreams of the mid-90s to early 2000s. Ideas such as cyberstates, virtual states, islands in the net, temporary autonomous zones, as foreseen by the greats such as John Barlow, Peter Ludlow, Jerry Everard, Bruce Sterling, and Hakim Bey. There is similar conception as to what Balaji is now popularizing as the network state. And together, as we build this kind of new order, with it, we need to evolve our political formula. But there's some conceptual issues in our political formula. Typically, what we do is we view it through the lens of technology, that we recognize that the blockchain represents an immutable order, that we recognize that consensus is a part-time parliament in the conception of Leslie Lamport's paper titled the same, introducing the Paxos protocol. We recognize that there's coders, there's miners, there's validators, that they build and maintain this order, yet we ignore them when it comes to talking about the individual. When we talk about ideas of self-sovereignty or the sovereign individual. And how do we actually claim, legitimately claim this notion of self-sovereignty? Because the individual themselves, they might be signing a transaction, but ultimately they are dependent on the authority of the order, of this disintermediated transaction flowing through the network. No, I think a more deeper way to look at this is to actually understand that these are rights. These are rights bestowed on the individual, and they are gifted to anyone who participates in the order by the authority of the order, of the protocol. We are subject individuals of this crypto order. And this talk is about trying to explain where this comes from by looking at crypto through a different political lens. So, I think, I mean, who here is familiar with the DAO hack that happened in Ethereum, right? Okay, cool. So, for me, this is probably the largest whiplash in our ideology for me personally. Up until this point, I drank the Kool-Aid and I believed that these systems were completely immutable, illegal systems, that they were pure, like they were technology in of themselves, and were not really influenced by anything else. The reality is, though, that while we can make claims of self-sovereignty about securing our private keys and having the confidence that the network will be impartial to us as long as that our transaction is actually, that the majority of the people in the network are ambivalent to our transaction. However, there are transactions, there are violations in code that creates this notion of a crisis, right? And additionally, we have this strong argument of popular sovereignty in a quasi-Westphalian sense. This participation is voluntary and non-coercive, and we'll get into this notion of popular sovereignty or consent of the governed later. But this term sovereignty, the more I think about it, the more it eludes me, and the concept becomes harder and harder to nail down or grasp. Where does this sovereignty in our networks actually lie? And this is not to disparage what happened in the DAO hack and how the Ethereum community responded to it. These kind of contentious hard forks happen in almost every chain in one way or another. But what happens when there is a hard fork or the change of the policy, the network changes, our rights change along with it. And the DAO fork in particular, and even protocol upgrades that involve some kind of fork, they involve a lot of off-chain governance and require coordination of developers, miners, and exchanges. And those who oppose the change to the political formula, in the case of Ethereum, moved into Ethereum Classic, and that's kind of why it exists, because it maintains that the existing or the original political formula. But this presents us with a problem that's not readily admitted by our political formula, that there is an organized minority that builds and maintains the order. It's an oligarchy. It's an elite. And when you look into what like sovereignty means, like as I said, the concept gets harder to nail down. But in looking at it, I came across Carl Schmitt's political theology, and he actually has a very interesting take on how he views sovereignty. He believes that sovereignty lies with the exception, or the person who has the authority when the crisis happens. He goes on to say the exception is more interesting than the rule, that the rule proves nothing, the exception proves everything. And in the exception, the power of real life breaks through the crust of a mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. So when he is critical of a legalistic order that continues operating, very much like how a blockchain just continues going in normal times, right, as it is designed. We're very lucky that we've created a robust order that is very resistant to various kinds of attacks and maintains itself. Yet, even we cannot escape when this order falls into crisis. Even we are still bound by a governing minority. And so to understand this a little bit better, I started getting into, started turning towards like the Italian elite theorists or political realists, such as Gaetano Mosca, Pareto, and Robert Michels. They wouldn't be surprised at the social dynamics that happens in crypto like this. Mosca takes a historical perspective in the ruling class and basically views almost every society having some kind of elite structure behind it. Robert Michels takes the concept even further and applies it to almost every social system, whether it's families, totems, tribes, cities, nations, empires, and so on. Michels would go on to claim the iron law of oligarchy, right? And basically explains that there's three major factors why this happens. One is mass and scale, where you physically can't just get everybody into the same room. And like even if you did have a voting system, you still need to narrow down the choices, and people need to do that in some form. They also go on to say that the majority of people also don't have the interest to be in constant referenda. They don't have the time or interest because they want to live their own lives. The other reason is more bureaucratic. Outside of whatever the system it is, whatever organization it is, there are a bunch of other administrative things you have to do. Say if you're looking to rally a vote, you have to get all of the infrastructure in place to do that. You need to do marketing campaigns, all of these things. It doesn't actually work out very well using purely technological solutions. Now that's not to say that we can't improve that with technological solutions. I mean, that's certainly the attempts of DAOs. But even DAOs have found themselves with a small minority that is coordinating the masses around it. And this kind of falls into the tactical side of things, right? Elites choose themselves. They're the ones that are actually going out. We have this conception that the people choose, but then why do you get leads such as Biden or Trump, you know, of the apex of the free world, I guess? In short, if there's no leadership, there's no plan, there's no coordination amongst the masses. They go on to divide the elites into basically two classes. One are the governing elites, or politicians, and the non-governing elites, the bureaucracies. So in our space, like you could view like the governing elites as like the researchers, the coders, the whales, or the large stakeholders in the network. And the bureaucracy would be the miners, the validators, and even the foundations to help maintain these orders. No man rules alone, and any governing body is going to need an apparatus of people to fulfill the day-to-day functions of running the place. But the thing is like what we do, at least here, is we innovate on what's called social mobility. If you're able to code or contribute in some form, we have open forums, and it allows us to have anybody come into the space and contribute value. And this is where the real innovation happens. Now, we can use this elite model not only to look at elites within our space, but you can also look at crypto as a singleton. For anyone holding a similar political formula, from the outside, it looks the same. And then this is where we can start to see, this is where we can start to see the power of crypto in some ways as a movement. Maurice goes on to say that there is a shift in the balance of political forces, then the manner in which the ruling class is constituted changes also. If a new source of wealth develops in a society, if a practical importance of knowledge grows, if an old religion declines or a new one is born, if a new current idea spreads, then simultaneously far-reaching dislocations occur in the ruling class. Crypto has developed out a new source of wealth. It has a new set of knowledge. It is a new religion. The elite theorists also show us that if the ruling classes fail to adapt their formula based on the changed demands of society, then the ruling classes can either basically renew themselves or they will be renewed into themselves. And this is the position that we have. If we cannot work with these current elites and get them to adopt our technology, then they have a chance of not being not renewing themselves and their political formula, and a new set of elites will rise. But the elite theorists don't really talk about how this process actually works or why this is actually the case. And for that, we can turn towards Bertrand de Jouvenel. He has a fantastic book called On Power, and he tries to view power as almost like an abstract concept, something like Ted Kaczynski's technological process. Power is this process that is acting independently of humans once it starts to form. And Jouvenel also identifies this notion of like two classes of elites, although he's not viewing them as elites. He's viewing it as at a center of power, and then the delegations to power, so the subsidiaries, which would be the bureaucracy in this case. And for Jouvenel, he basically both views the center of power as well as the subsidiaries in basically, how am I doing for time? Oh, I could just keep rambling on forever. And so I'm clearing out the house anyway, so. So basically, he views both the center and the subsidiary as trying to expand and increase their power. And this creates tension and conflict. Typically, when we look at a government or something like that, we tend to look at it as a singleton. But the reality is it's actually many competing powers somewhat working together. So there's a center and subsidiary conflict in which the subsidiary wants to grow in power, but at the same time, so the subsidiary is intentionally trying to resist the expansion of the center's power. And so, therefore, the center is then put into a position where it has to undermine the subsidiary. And how they both do that is they start making appeals to the periphery, or the people. And if they can do that, they start to undermine the subsidiary or the center, and this creates a dependency of the periphery onto the center in most cases. And this leads to the expansion of governance and of power. Yeah, and I mean, as I said, like Jouvenel views power as like basically an egregore, as basically a process that's running independently of humans in itself. But he also recognizes a dualistic nature in power. On one hand, it is incredibly social, it's trying to help and support, but on the other hand, it has a lust for power, essentially, and is constantly going on it basically tries to exploit society in the efforts of trying to seek out new adventures, more or less. There's also a shrouding nature to power, which we probably won't see in this talk, but we'll see a little bit of it. And this comes through the appeals to the periphery. And shrouding only mean like camouflage. So democracy is like a form of this camouflage, as well as this notion of the sovereign individual, or like this disintermediated transactions in some sense. It is intentionally preventing people from seeing where the authority actually lies. So Juvenal has a very clear example of this happening. And he talks about the sort of post-Roman collapse and the rise of the Germanic kingdoms. And he goes to great pains to point out how Philip II Augustus had no taxation, he had no standing army, he had no government officials, and he had very little wealth. He had very little power and was utterly dependent on the nobles or lords around him. Yet, if you fast forward 400 years, to Louis the 14th, is that right? Yeah. You have like widespread taxation. He has a standing army of 200,000 men. He has a court and police force. He has a government apparatus, and most importantly, has a royal treasury. What was I going to say? Yes, and during this time, Juvenal argues that in this period, there was basically the tools for expansion and consolidation of power were taxation, coinage, military reform, patronage, and law. So, Juvenal argues that basically the first signs of this centralization or consolidation of power was really through the redevelopment of coinage post-Roman Empire collapse, which started to happen within the 13th century. From his perspective, coinage requires an organized supply of metal, minting and mining, an organized market, and initial demand, such as taxation. And for the reason why people or power is seeking this is because coinage enables disintermediated relationships dependent on an authority, which allows the power to expand without actually having to be involved. And it's not dissimilar to what we see in crypto. Coinage allows the center of the power to bypass the feudal or the feudal lords, basically. Rather than doing payment in kind or in dues, now they are forced to use coinage, which then gets forced onto the people within the local lordship. More importantly, once this is is in place, this allows the center power to start patronage and start hiring mercenaries, for example, that are loyal to him, rather than having to be loyal to get the buy-in from a local lord and his men. It becomes the foundation for new institutions. There is the capacity, if you're controlling the supply of metal and the markets, then you can do monetary debasement, which always allows you to leverage power against the subsidiaries and weaken them. And it allows for the transfer of wealth of long distances. This is really interesting, like from a crypto perspective, because you can look at the proof of work versus proof of stake mechanism as being a form of this Juvenalian conflict, in the sense that the center power is establishing proof of stake, which then undermines this proof of work miner subsidiaries and allows for the expansion of the coinage or of the money. It allows people to essentially mine or stake within that network, and it allows further spread. The power becomes more efficient. But we also see this with the rise of CBDCs and banks. The federal central bank that's setting up the central bank digital currency is effectively undermining the subsidiaries, the banks, right? The other advent is the rule of law. Authority, not truth, makes law. In a similar way, the written law allows for widespread transmission. Equality under the law actually undermines subsidiaries or local authority. And it creates yet another source of revenue for those who institute some kind of legal system. It creates another dependency on the authority. Oh, geez. That PDF did not work out well. Okay. Okay. Well, okay. So basically, we can see how this law mechanism worked between King Stephen and the reign of King Henry II, right? So under King Stephen, there was effectively, he was incompetent as a leader and as a holder of power, and it led to a bunch of it led to what's called the anarchy. This is a period of social unrest, political fragmentation, breakdown of law and order. The church ended up filling in the power gap, trying to restore order, but more importantly, the barons started to regain power as well, and they started building unlicensed castles, and more importantly, they started ruling the populace with an iron fist. When King Stephen was deposed, then King Henry II came in, and he wanted to return to the lion of justice of King Henry I. And his immediate actions were to consolidate royal jurisdiction and have primacy over the local courts, as well as regain control over the church. And through this, he set up basically a traveling circus, right? He had a royal court, but it would travel with him. It wasn't actually in a fixed place. And so he would go from village to village, or feudal town to feudal town, settling disputes. He started to do reformations on civil, criminal, and ecclesiastical law. Sorry, I haven't pronounced that, I've only read it. Which were effectively undermining the lordship's courts, as well as the church's courts. And this basically, eventually this court settled in Westminster, and they started to transmit the monarch's decisions globally, or within his kingdom, right? But one of the aspects here is that he ends up extending these rights to free men, and free men were people who had no allegiance to any baron or any lord, but now they were under the protection of the kings of the royal court. We have a better form of this in the form of smart contracts, where it is closer to the properties of coinage or money, where it now becomes disintermediated, right? You can have autocentric law, where individuals can start to create their own contracts between each other, yet these contracts are effectively dependent on the authority of the order that we've created. And in talking about these free men, Juvenal also basically views two forms of liberty. One is economic liberty, and one is political liberty. And this is how we can start getting back to this notion of this notion of self-sovereignty. He views economic liberty as self-asserted liberty, one that's not reliant on a primary power, which is what we try to espouse. It is aristocratic and is enforced by the subsidiaries. Juvenal argues that people are actually freer under a local lord in most cases until they become tyrants. But the inverse of this is a political liberty. This is granted to those who do not have this economic liberty. This is the ones that are granted to free men. But the problem with this is it creates a dependency on the center power, and therefore it allows this power to expand. Slides up way over here. So, and this starts to allow us to get into this notion of like popular legitimacy and where the individual came. For Juvenal, these political ideals were actually appeals from the center to the periphery through this Juvenalian conflict. And therefore it becomes this engine that allows a more and more focus towards the individual as a means of legitimacy and justification. So with King Charles II first, he ended up, well, his charge was he was a tyrant. He was accused of overthrowing the rights and liberties of the people, and this was the first time that there was a real challenge to the divine rights of kings. But more importantly, there was an elevation of the parliament as representatives of the people, yet it was the parliament themselves, the parliamentarians themselves that were acting on, had enshrined themselves as representatives of the people. Another development into this was with King James II, and this is basically the beginning of the Enlightenment in some ways. King James II had converted to Catholicism and started basically stacking all key positions with Catholics. And the parliamentarian Protestants didn't like this, as well as him starting to establish a standing army, and ultimately deposed him and put his daughter into power, and this became the effective secularization of our Western power structures, but also and the end of the divine right of kings. And this led literally the year after to the Bill of Rights. But in both of these cases, it was the power grab from both of these centers was too fast, which then caused this massive reaction. This continues, right, through this notion of appeals to the people and by extension the individual continues. And again, we see another juvenile conflict with the establishment of the United States of America, declaring their independence from the British Crown. In the Declaration of Independence, they say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed with the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these is life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And here, this notion of rights implies that there is an authority that can actually uphold these rights on the behalf of the individual. And this is where you start to understand that like liberalism itself is actually state individualist constitutionalism. This is an idea by Misleading. But again, like I talked about this notion of like a shroud or camouflage of this power, and like this is where we start to see this notion of it come into place. By the time it's post-World War II, the universal human rights are declared as a draft, but they're really bizarre because they're no longer based in natural law. In fact, they have no basis whatsoever. Really. So there's this passage here that basically justifies that it comes through, it has a means of a justification, or its political theology is this notion of cause of peace, right? And the second passage here is like, among those engaged in the promotion of human rights, there is a general agreement that the rights are an aspect of humanity, that they are not dependent on characteristics such as race, nationality, gender, nor do they depend on the person's presence within a territory or political entity. They're effectively ethical norms with legal backing, but like, what does that actually mean, right? And if it's not dependent on any of these characteristics, who is making the determinations for these things? Another development in human rights, which is less recognized, also happened in the 70s. I would love to see this graph added to what the fuck happened in 1971, so if you have any connections to that, I think that'd be a great idea. Because this is basically the time when the United States was asked by the UN to adopt human rights as their foreign policy. And this effectively meant that nation states had become the subsidiaries and the center of power had become global. This became very apparent in, say, the collapse, prior to the collapse of the USSR. There are a whole bunch of humanitarian NGOs set up in those countries, as well as dictatorships in Latin America, which were then heavily funded by transnational elites that effectively started to espouse these human rights, these appeals to the periphery. And shortly after, these various political structures had collapsed. Now, it's not just like Juvenal's never really trying to say that this is either a good thing or a bad thing. It's just this notion of, it's just this process of power and like how this is starting to expand. Today, this notion of power is global. And even at the world stage, it's very unclear like how this is supposed to work. So with the United Nations, it's supposed to be like the main formal body for how governance decisions happen around the planet. But the reality is that it has too many procedures, it's considered to be too impotent, and it's very exclusionary to other non-state actors. And so you get these transnational policy networks starting to form, such as the Bilderberg Group or the World Economic Forum, which allows for inclusion of corporations and other high net worth individuals who want to have a say in global governance. But it starts to create this other strange form of soft power, one that's based on selection, secrecy, and status. So a transnational policy network will leech status from invitees to it, but at the same time, it can guide policy by selecting very specific kinds of people for very specific kinds of conversations. And they deliberately create an air of secrecy so that world leaders can basically talk in private. So what am I trying to say with all of this, right? What I'm trying to say is that we as crypto, we have a robust order with a parliament and it's resistant to being overthrown. We have a poised counter-elite. We're transnational by design. We have abstracted expansory tools, both in the forms of money, law, and taxation. We have strong juridical defense as well as enforcement. We have a competitive political formula. We have social mobility into elite circles. And we have a stronger case for popular sovereignty legitimacy, both from the fact of consent of the government, but which is the participation in the network itself, but explicit consent in services rendered by the order, and the fact that we have to transact with it. It is non-coercive. It has cheap exit costs. We offer, even though we still have this notion of a subject individual, we offer stronger liberty to those individuals that participate in it. I think crypto is a new center of power. It is power transformed, and it's rising. And our real task is to actually start to see how crypto can be a model for world order, because that's where power needs to be tempered the most. Anyway, thanks for listening to me ramble on for a bit. There's social, check out Logos and Status IM. Thanks.